Hi everyone, we're getting back to the skills development portion of our class, and in another video I posted something in regards to your ASL skills development book. We looked at Unit 3 and Unit 4, lexical substitution and paraphrasing prepositions, and what we looked at there was how one word can have many concepts implied or embedded or held in that one meaning. Um, we talked about elocutionary force and how in spoken English uh, we can carry a lot of meaning in our intonation. And in ASL, our meaning comes in our facial grammar and those grammatical features. We also talked about passive voice, how it's difficult to interpret that into ASL, and how we need to paraphrase into an active voice sentence in order to get the meaning across. We also talked about unpacking prepositions, and give me 1 second as I'm looking at my notes. And we also discussed basically how this is an important tool in your interpretation skills box, your toolbox that you have moving forward. So now what I want to do is get into the English skills development book. Mostly you've been working on this independently and completing the exercises, but I don't want you to think that this is unimportant work. What you're doing is building those skills and building your toolbox and building your imagine a file cabinet full of vocabulary, be it signs or words that you can pull from for your interpretations. And so what I'd like to do now in this video is to talk about English skills development and how it approaches lexical substitution, which is very similar, but it kind of expanded on some of the meanings as it went through it in the unit. So this is from the ASL skills development video and also from the ASL skills development book, and it's a quote from your book that described what lexical substitution is. And it reminds us that, as it says on the slide, the more fluent you are in any language, the easier it is to use synonyms, antonyms, idioms, etc. Which means the more vocabulary you have, the more dynamic you can be as a speaker or signer of that language. Which means the better you can express yourself, the more abstract concepts you could convey, and the more skilled you are as a user of that language. And the book reminds us that developing the lexical substitution skills increases your linguistic fluency, which is that ability to quickly find an alternative way to express an idea. And it reminds us that that's the most important skill, or one of the most important skill required in simultaneous interpreting. So that ability to quickly go left or go right, you know, as an athlete would, is what the interpreter is doing in finding different ways to convey a message all in real time without too much of a delay. Getting back to the English skills development book, this is what the English skills development book describes lexical substitution as, which is the process of replacing a word or lexical item with another word or lexical item. And the key is without changing the meaning or the message, which is something, it's like you should imagine that not changing the meaning or the message is the biggest responsibility and the biggest weight on your shoulders, because you can paraphrase, you can change them, you can deliver whatever, but what is so cherished and so golden and so valued, what's preserved, what's your job to preserve, is that meaning and that message, no matter what angle, how you spin it or how you deliver it or how it is you craft it. That's what can't change. And so an example of what I mean by that is what I put here on the left-hand side of your screen, which is the sentence, "The test was tough." So if you see on the left-hand side, there's 3 sentences. It was a hard test. the test was hard, the exam was difficult. And so none of those really change what the person is saying by saying, wow, that test was tough. But if you look on the right-hand side, those sentences do alter the meaning. If you say, I struggled with the exam versus the test was tough, that's changing the meaning. Because if the person said the test was tough, nobody said I struggled. It was just a tough test. Or likewise, I did not prepare for the exam. The test was tough doesn't mean I didn't prepare for it. And likewise, the third sentence, I had no time to study for such a difficult exam. Nothing at all could be further from the truth. Or it could be the truth, but it's not what I said. So that sentence, the test was tough, and the idea that you can say it, those three very similar but different ways without changing the meaning, that's what we're trying to build. That skill is what you're trying to build now. And to recognize I struggled with the exam is not what the person said. I did not prepare for the exam is not what the person said. And I had no time to study for such a difficult exam. Again, not what the person said. So not what you would be rendering in your message. And that's what lexical substitution is. Finding different ways to say the same thing, again, without changing the meaning or message, which is, again, I want to remind you, the big responsibility on your shoulders. And so your book talks about 5 areas of word level discourse. And if you're wondering, what is word level discourse? It's just the most basic stage of any language. So we can narrow it down, a passage, a novel, whatever language is, a long sentence, a run-on sentence, the most basic unit can be described into these 5 word level discourse units. And what your book names them, which is probably important, propositional units, specific general words, primary and secondary meaning of words, collocations, and jargon. Your book calls it jargon, and I've added specialized vocabulary because that's typically what we call it in the community and in the field when somebody reaches out to I need an interpreter with specialized vocabulary knowledge of biology, nursing, medical, whatever. We tend to call it specialized vocabulary, but it means jargon. And your book calls it jargon. And so what is a propositional unit? That is spelled correctly. The book does not say prepositional because the prepositional phrase is something that comes up later. It's a propositional unit. So the proposition is an idea unit, which basically in my mind, I think of as a word. What's an idea or what's a word? And the example I listed there that your book lists also is, for example, the word man or the sign man, which is part of a larger concept. What does man mean? An adult, a male, a mammal. And we had similarly discussed in the ASL video about paraphrasing prepositions when we talked about the example of the man offering a lecture. Could the man be a speaker, a teacher, a paid inspirational speaker? It could mean so many things. Is it a classroom? Is it a workshop? Is it something we all paid to show up for? Orientation? What does that sentence mean? And so this breaks it down to the smallest unit, which is an idea, or you can think of as a word. And another example that your book gives is, for example, the word father or the concept of father, which could really have several concepts. It could really take the conversation in a different direction if you think about a biological father, an adoptive father, a priest, a father figure, someone who has fathered a child but has nothing to do with them, and the directions this conversation could go could end up being many. And so that's the idea of what does one idea, how many concepts can one idea convey to you? And what does one idea hold? How much can it hold within it? And for your part, to think in how many directions can this go, but also not to jump with a sign or even with a voice interpretation, because how many directions can this go? And so back to that ASL skills development video and the slides, we talked about, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the man is speaking to his student. And how do we unpack a whole preposition? Within each word, it's possible to find more than a concept. So there's a man, there's a student, the man may be a teacher, maybe his teacher, maybe a different, maybe his brother's teacher, and the student may be his student, maybe another person's student, maybe just a student of the institution. And so you start to unpack what these things can possibly mean. So back to the English skills development book. The English skills development book tells us that there are specific words to general words. And so some words are just general in nature. An example that the book gives is furniture. Furniture can mean the sofa, the chair, the desk, or the table. But more specifically, when grouped together, a sofa and chair can mean something that you sit on. A desk and a table, when grouped together, can mean something that you write on. But broadly, we can call all of them, we can group all of them together, we can group them separately, and call them furniture. And another example is fruit. Specifically, fruit can mean strawberries, grapes, pineapples, apples, oranges, etc. And as a category, we can call it fruit. Similarly, I'd like to remind you that sometimes in ASL, people, the way they communicate in ASL is to list things. But we don't typically list things when in spoken English language. And so when someone lists things, it's okay to paraphrase it into a general word. So if somebody says strawberries, apples, oranges, and bananas, you could say fruit. For example, I went shopping and bought apples, bananas, blah, blah, blah. And if that's not the purpose, because again, your goal is to identify the main idea. This is not the main idea of sharing this information. Your voice interpretation says, I happened to be grocery shopping and I picked up some fruit. That's perfectly fine to do because, again, you're also culturally mediating. So remember that there are ASL features that if you just interpret word for word, don't necessarily make sense to a hearing person listening. And what happens is that you've lost them now in conversation. You may have lost their attention, and your job is to facilitate communication. So you want to take those things kind of seriously, but be aware of them. It's not a big deal to say the sofa and the chair and the desk and the table. It's, in the grand scheme of things, not a big deal. But does it make you a better interpreter, a smoother interpreter, a better communicator? And does it make you sound a little less weird if you just say furniture? It's something to consider. So the point of substitutions is that they're important in the interpretation because words don't always have a one-for-one translation. Not all words have that sign. For example, we know that sofa, chair, desk, table has a sign that's furniture. We know that strawberries, grapes, pineapple, apples, and oranges has a sign that's fruit. We know that. But there may be signs that don't have a one-for-one translation. But if you have the vocabulary in your reserve to pull from to be able to transmit that information, it makes your job all that easier, but it makes you also understood. And what's worse, if you're the professional communicator, the interpreter, and nobody understands what you said. And it happens. It has happened to me where I offered my interpretation and everyone was like, what? And I'm thinking to myself, what? Let me try again. Because what I've done is I've just kind of thrown up words at somebody. And what my job to do is to structure something that can be understood. So the other word liver discourse that your book mentions is primary and secondary meaning, which is to say that many words have more than one meaning. And after distinguishing form from meaning, beware my slide has an extra and there. I'm going to remove it. And now it's gone. After distinguishing form from meaning, the interpreter must determine which meaning is the most appropriate for the given context. This is from page 90 in your English Skills Development book. And I want to take this opportunity to emphasize page 90 because the next 3 or 4 slides have quotes from page 90, which probably means page 90 is important, which probably means it's going to come up on a quiz or final exam. So, your responsibility is not to change the meaning of the message. Your responsibility is also to determine which meaning is the most appropriate for a given context. And I put an example that's very familiar to us now is the sentence of any given press conference. The example spoken is COVID positive test results. And the interpreter chooses to interpret that to COVID, be it fingerspelled or signed, have in body. That's important because what the interpreter has done is the interpreter has determined the meaning to be inappropriate for the context, meaning what is a positive test result? Is it a positive thing to have COVID? Is that conceptually accurate? But what does it really mean? And so what the interpreter has chosen to do is to figure out, here's the form that we've gotten in the English form. What does it mean? Because I need to be clear and I need to render that message. But the primary meaning of positive is not to have it in your body. If we go back to what primary and secondary meaning means, what your book means is the primary meaning is usually the first one listed in the dictionary, the most generic, or the one that comes to mind of the location. I don't want to criticize interpreters that are doing this because it's really easy to criticize from the sidelines. Sometimes it just comes out, it's coming too fast and it comes out. And so I really don't want to criticize interpreters who have chosen to do that. But what I want to say is the flip side is to applaud and commend the interpreters who have chosen not to do that, because that means that they've given thought to the meaning of what is being said. And it's very difficult to hear, and I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, to hear the word positive and not do that. It's really difficult because I'm hearing it and I'm going so fast, and it'd be so easy just to say that and keep going. But that's the job. That's what you're doing, is you're critically thinking about how to deliver that message. And so the primary meaning of positive is what this is referring to, but the secondary meaning is, as we look at the second bullet, it says the linguistic and social context provides the most helpful way to determine which meaning is intended. The primary meaning of the word positive, is something optimistic. The secondary meaning, we're using context to understand COVID positive test results. We're using context to understand that it's screening positive, as in screening for a yes, the person has COVID. Hence the interpretation that is rendered. So here, continuing on the primary and secondary meaning, this is also from your book, and I'll give you a second to look at it. I want you to really look at that bullet at the very top that says, when the interpreter has a large vocabulary and is able to analyze the linguistic and social context in which they find themselves, the interpreter is more likely to render an interpretation that is faithful to the intended message. This is going to be really key, and is something that I hope you take with you your whole career, is to think about how you deliver a message. And I keep saying that as students of interpreting, your interpreting work is going to be interpreting with intention. You're trained, you're going to be thoughtful, you're going to be a critical thinker, and so you're going to think about examples like the word positive in the COVID positive test results, and you're going to know, I'm going to choose not to sign that. I'm going to choose to sign something more clear, more conceptually accurate, more visually accurate for a deaf person to understand, especially when the audience can be anybody. Could be a range of ASL users. And so if we look at the slide, the distinction between the linguistic context, which is what includes information such as speech or speech and conversation, which is my example, what is spoken, the COVID positive test results, and the social context being what is made up of the setting, be it a formal setting, a hospital setting, or the people who are in this type of communicative event, which is, to the example of the COVID positive test results, why that interpreter in my example is choosing not to sign positive, but instead to sign COVID or any variation of that. And another example I have here that I've listed there on the slide, the very bottom, is the flip side. When you have voice interpretation, as we've seen in the voice interpretations that I've posted, is signs that imply or embed information of deaf culture. You have to consider the social context. If you were in a deaf event social setting and you're interpreting and the deaf person signs VP, VRS, or this, or even, do you have to expand and do you have to say anything other than VP, or say anything other than VRS, or say anything other than at school or at the school for the deaf? Maybe not. Not if you're in a social setting that's all people aware of deaf culture. But let's say that context is not that setting. Let's say it's a deaf presenter telling a story for a room full of hearing teachers. Then maybe you don't say VP. Maybe you have to say my video phone. And maybe you don't say VRS. Maybe you say video relay service and add a little, that's how I make phone calls. And maybe you don't say just a school for the deaf, but you say a residential school for the deaf. You expand on it because of the setting. And it's not changing the meaning, but it's adding clarity to the message, because you have to understand, again, the linguistic context and the social context in order to deliver the most appropriate interpretation, still faithful to the intended message. Whew, that's a lot, right? I would think that is a huge responsibility to have, because they're not your words. It's somebody else's words. So sometimes when I think about interpreting high-profile events or high-profile settings, I really feel the weight of making sure that I value, I place the right value on the message. You know, I understand the speaker's intention and what they value, and I hope to deliver it the same. I hope not to change the meaning, because changing the meaning is something that happens for a few reasons. It could happen because you're interpreting carelessly. Maybe you've reached fatigue and you have some errors, but you're not thinking or doing things with intention, or you simply don't understand the message. So it could be different reasons why you're doing it. Not necessarily to mean that you don't care what you put out there, but maybe you do care. You're just fatigued, or you didn't understand exactly what they said. And sometimes you don't understand that you didn't understand until you're like, oh, that's what I said? Is that what you meant? And so it's a very big responsibility on the shoulders of interpreters. I always think that we have such great privilege to be able to be part of people's lives and people's experiences. We also have a really big responsibility to honor those experiences and respect those experiences, and to offer those interpretations as true to the message as possible, so that we don't take away from those experiences. Because when you don't offer an interpretation that is true and faithful to the intended message, you're really robbing someone of the experience they could have had or that they should be having. And that's why it's difficult to see unqualified interpreters, or interpreters that are in assignment maybe they shouldn't be. And I want to be clear that I'm not one that I don't typically criticize people. I encourage people to take healthy challenges, but it does disappoint me when there's an interpreter that should know better and maybe step aside, because what we're doing is we're really robbing people of their experiences, and it's their right to have them. But it's so amazing when we're the right fit and we're the right person and the right skill level, because magic happens and it feels so amazing for everyone, including for yourself, when you're able to participate in that. The next word level discourse that your book mentions is compounds and collocations. This is now page 91. So reminder that this might be important stuff in the book. English skills development. So what are compounds? Compounds are made up of two words that function as one word, but the meaning is expressed by the compound and is not always available by looking at the two words separately that comprise it. One example that your book gives is the word blackboard, which could mean a green board, a green chalkboard in a classroom. It could mean a whiteboard with markers, dry erase board, but it could also mean, and I've added this, but Blackboard is the name of a learning management systems that some schools use instead of Canvas. It's a version of Canvas. And so that word blackboard can mean a lot of things. How do you understand? You understand it again by the social context, as we just discussed. And collocations are constructions that contain two or more words that routinely occur in close proximity and function as a unit. These are the examples that your book gave, which is to pay a visit, wasting time, breaking rules. Do you pay a visit in ASL? Do you waste time in ASL? How do you break rules in ASL? Those are important questions. So I just got a great idea for an assignment, and I'm going to write it down. Stay tuned for the video that you will be submitting. Something important about collocations is that your book specifically says that learners of a second language often make mistakes using collocations, because there might be a collocation that makes sense in one language and they try to use it in the other language. For example, pay a visit makes sense in English, not quite in ASL. Something paid off. paid off doesn't really translate. And the flip side, an example that I wanted to give you um, of how I see it in mostly in voice interpretations is um, when people put both together. For example, in ASL, we have a rhetorical question that usually someone is about to indicate, why did I do this weird thing? I'll explain. And I often hear interpreters say, why because? Or they'll say, why did I do this thing? And then they'll go do it. We talked about this before, about ASL features popping up in your interpretation. I often sometimes see signers do why? Because. But because is not an ASL feature. Why is. Because is a very English thing that's kind of creeped up. It's like uh, it's called language intrusion, which is when the language that you're not communicating in intrudes into the language that you are communicating in. And so the why, again, is the ASL feature. The because is the English intruding into it, which would also, you could also argue that is what paid off might be an English intrusion if that's how you're signing it. How would you sign paid off? I might ask that later. So then your book goes on to describe jargon, which again, I'm adding the specialized vocabulary terminology to it because it's really the way we speak about it in the field and in work. We don't really use the term jargon anymore. Your book uses it, but I use specialized vocabulary. I wanted to put both because you might see jargon in the future. As you see in the slide there, jargon may mean terminology used in a specific field or topic area. Jargon typically has meaning for the people in a specific group, but may be misunderstood or not understood by people who are not members of that group. So understanding jargon and specialized vocabulary becomes key for prep work, which is what we call preparing for an assignment or building schema for an assignment, brainstorming before an assignment. Some specialized vocabulary could be, in the college setting, could be vocabulary for biology, math, algebra, statistics, any kind of specialized classes like that. In the community, it could be medical settings, legal settings. That's really what they mean by specialized vocabulary. And it's something really that an interpreter has to prepare for, because the truth is that if you don't understand what you're hearing or what you're seeing, you can't effectively interpret it. So oftentimes there's a lot of prep work that goes behind that. It's kind of cool to be the interpreter that shows up and does things off the cuff and shows up to assignments and is just skilled in everything. But that's actually not the case. That happens often, especially as your work becomes more specialized. I find that I like to prep for work, at least get an idea of what something is about, especially when it seems to be difficult. And I always think about PR. A friend of mine, I should say, a friend and colleague, once said to me, if I do an assignment I'm not qualified for, that's just bad PR. I'm going to look bad. So I'm just rather not take it. And I thought, you know what? Absolutely. That's a great perspective to have. Because in the end, absolutely. Why do you want to put a bad business card out there, right? For the same reason, you want to put your best foot forward and try and prep as much as possible. I will say that sometimes we prep for the wrong thing. We don't always get complete information. I have a current assignment that comes to mind where they gave me so much extensive information for me to look up, and I did a lot of research a couple weeks before I arrived. Like one word from that big file the agency sent me actually showed up on the assignment, and I was like, I did so much work. I'll just uh, understand things for next time, I guess. It's just part of the job. So, lastly, your book talks about the role of lexical substitution in the interpretation process. And I just want to end by reminding you of this, that developing those lexical substitution skills increase your linguistic flexibility. And that's what you want to be. You want to flex your linguistic skills when you're interpreting and be able to pull from your toolbox, because just the more prepared you are, the more confident you are, and just the easier your workflows. The ability to find a synonym is one of the component skills required in the simultaneous interpretation process. This is from the English Skills Development book, which is the same as your ASL Skills Development book. Reiterates to us and reminds us that what you're doing is building your vocabulary and building your skill set, because what you want it to become is like muscle memory, not like your assignment where you're like sitting and thinking about something, but you want it to just come off your hands and roll off the tongue like smooth and seamlessly, like the amazing interpreter that you are setting out to be. So that concludes, I believe, yes it does, it concludes English Skills Development Unit 3, Lexical Substitutions. I included some pages that looked important to me and some vocabulary that looked important to me that might be on a test. And stay tuned for an assignment to follow. Thanks.